So for this month, the patrons have chosen Bulbasaurus as the what the hell is this animal? And if you're expecting a lot of comparisons to a very particular Pokemon which is very similarly named, I'm here to disappoint you, at least a little bit. And that's because Bulbasaurus had totally legitimate, not made up or contrived reasons for being named Bulbasaurus, such as the nasal bosses, which were very bulbous and large on this animal. The saurus part makes a little less sense though, because saurus means lizards, and lizard hadn't even evolved at this point when Bulbasaurus lived during the end Permian. So if it's not a lizard, what the hell is it? Well, on top of not being a lizard, there's other clues that suggest it wasn't even a reptile. And if you've been on the channel before, you've heard me talk about the differences between synapsids and diapsids. The diapsids include the reptiles. They essentially have two sets of holes in their skull that help for muscle attachments. Bulbasaurus doesn't have this. Instead, it just has a zygomatic arch, the same kind of hole in the skull that even people have, that makes up our cheekbones. Muscles pass through this and are able to power the jaw that way. But that means that Bulbasaurus is a lot closer to the mammals than it is to the reptiles. It's still not quite a mammal, but it is a branch on the lineage that would have eventually led to them. A lot of the animals related to Bulbasaurus, though, also have saurus in their name, and that's because for a long time they were thought to be reptiles. In fact, they're so similar that Bulbasaurus was thought to be an entirely different animal for a long time. There were 6 specimens of Bulbasaurus that came from museum collections, and these were all listed under a different name that we now know it didn't actually belong to, that name being Tropidostoma, which we will talk about later, and once we get to talking about it later, we'll also bring up the bulbous parts of Bulbasaurus again. However, before that, we can actually look at the species name for Bulbasaurus, because it actually tells us a lot about how it would have lived as well. The species name for Bulbasaurus would be Bulbasaurus phyloxyron, with phyloxyron in Greek meaning leaf raiser. And I want to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, where this is in no way related to any particular Pokemon which may or may not use the move Razor Leaf. It's totally legitimate that this animal has the name Leaf Raiser as the species name, because it's inferred that it would have had a sharp keratinous beak, which would have been used for shearing leaves off of plants so that it could feed. So while the name does seem very suggestive of particular Pokemon, it's important to remember it did have its own legitimate reasons for having a name that essentially translates to bulbous lizard with leaf razors. And with that in mind, we can actually, knowing that it has this leaf razor, understand what it would have eaten, and that's plants. And there's only really one major clade of the synapsids, which we mentioned it was a part of, that were around during the end Permian when Bulbasaurus was around. And that's the Dicynodonts, which include animals like Tropidostoma. The Dicynodonts were strange animals of the Permian and Triassic, and the most famous of these was actually Lystrosaurus, which survived the Permian-Triassic extinction, with wild numbers found in some of the same areas that Bulbasaurus comes from, only afterwards. And that's because Bulbasaurus didn't make it through that extinction. In fact, it may have died very early in that extinction period. However, that needs to be tested a little bit better. That being said, though, it does make sense that Bulbasaurus would go extinct during this extinction period, because this extinction was caused by massive volcanoes. And as anyone who's played the Pokemon games know, anything that's a grass type is weak to fire type, so it makes sense that it would go extinct during this time, because that's just a super effective attack. However, Lystrosaurus was able to dig, and so we also know that fire isn't very good against ground types, so it makes sense that Lystrosaurus was able to survive through the extinction. And with the concept of digging on the mind, we can actually dig deeper into what Bulbasaurus actually was. And that's because of those bulbous nasal bosses. They were much larger than any of the bosses that are found on most other Dicynodonts. And the reason I say most is because there is a single family, the E.D.G.E, which also had prominent nasal bosses. And these were likely used along with their tusks for competition within a single species. It's important to note, though, that Bulbasaurus had much larger and more bulbous nasal bosses than the other E.D.G.Es. So there is still a very legitimate reason for it having this name. So again, while it might seem very coincidental, that's really all it is, just a big coincidence. You shouldn't really read into it too far. I mean, except for the fact that one of the authors was quoted as having said, "If one wished to read between the lines concerning certain similarities, I wouldn't stop them." He later added that there were similarities between this species and certain other squat tusked quadrupeds that may not be entirely coincidental. So while there were legitimate reasons for naming Bulbasaurus Bulbasaurus, the idea for the name isn't necessarily the most original idea out there. And as much as you might think paleontologists are already pretty nerdy, there's so much more that you still don't know. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Yeah, this was a fun one. There should be another Pokemon video coming out soon too as well, so keep an eye out for that. and that will also just be an extra one. Keep in mind, you can vote for whatever I do in the What the Hell Are These videos by joining the Patreon. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank the patrons. And with that out of the way, I want to remind everyone to be safe, take care, wear a mask, and don't go extinct.